December 1944. While the Allies believed that winter would halt any German offensive, Hitler launched his final, desperate counterattack on the Western Front. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known as the Battle of the Bulge. At the heart of this brutal offensive were the Kampfgruppen, mobile combat groups made up of the most feared members of the Waffen-SS. Spearheading the vanguard was Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by the ambitious and ruthless SS Sturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a veteran of the Eastern Front and Himmler's protégé. This unit, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was equipped with Panther and King Tiger tanks, half-tracks and assault guns, and was tasked with breaking through to Stavelot, Stumont and beyond. Operating alongside it was Kampfgruppe Hansen, commanded by SS Standartenführer Max Hansen, also of the Leibstandarte, who was tasked with supporting the left flank of the advance and clearing the roads of American resistance. The third group was the Kampfgruppe Knittel, under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Gustav Knittel, a reconnaissance and rapid mobility force whose task was to secure key villages such as Trois Ponts and cover Peiper's advance from the rear. Finally, the Kampfgruppe Sandig, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Sandig, operated as a tactical reserve force, ready to reinforce the most critical points of the front or exploit any gaps. December, the plan that no one expected. September 1944. The Allies were inside Belgium. The border with Germany was increasingly thin. Western cities were under constant bombardment. In theory, the Third Reich was in retreat. But in the midst of this retreat, Hitler decided the unthinkable, to launch a counterattack. It wasn't a tactical move. It was a desperate attempt to reverse the war in a single blow. From his headquarters in Rastenburg, Hitler gave the personal order to plan a large-scale offensive. His goal was to cut the Allied forces in the west in half, break through the Ardennes, seize the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. If that was achieved, the British and American armies were supposed to be cut off from the rest of the front, without supplies, without lines of retreat, and then perhaps the West would sue for peace. That was the logic behind the plan. The operation was named Wacht am Rhein. Although it sounds defensive, it was anything but. On the maps, Hitler's generals drew 3 thick arrows pointing west. The most important one went north, where the main blow would fall. That arrow crossed a mountainous region with narrow roads, dense forests, and few viable passages for armored vehicles. That area was familiar to everyone, the Ardennes. Hitler had already used that same terrain in 1940, when German troops surprised France by sneaking in where no one expected. 4 years later, he bet that the Allies would make the same mistake, not expecting anything in that sector. But the situation in Germany was very different. There were no longer infinite reserves, no air dominance, no gasoline. To launch an attack of that magnitude, they had to improvise. Many divisions were incomplete. They lacked vehicles, cannons, fuel, and trained men. Therefore, a more flexible combat structure was used, the Kampfgruppen. The term was not new. It means battle group and had been used before in mobile or combined actions, but now it became the basis of the entire offensive. Each Kampfgruppe was an ad hoc formation created with whatever was available: infantry, tanks, self-propelled artillery, sappers, and even reconnaissance elements. They were assembled under the command of an experienced officer and assigned a specific section of advance. One of the most notable was the one entrusted to Joachim Peiper, an officer of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Adolf Hitler's Leibstandarte Division. Peiper was young, charismatic, brutal, and fanatical. He had served as Himmler's personal aide and had gained a reputation for his aggressiveness on the Eastern Front. His reputation made him the ideal candidate to lead an advance that required decisiveness and speed. Kampfgruppe Peiper was organized around the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, reinforced with mechanized infantry battalions, mobile artillery, assault engineers, and reconnaissance units. In total, it comprised some 4,000 men and more than 150 vehicles, including Panther and Tiger II tanks, half-track vehicles, assault guns, and transport trucks. Peiper's plan was clear. He was to advance along the narrowest axis of attack, penetrate the Losheim sector, traverse a chain of key towns, Honsfeld, Büllingen, Ligneville, Stavelot, Stumont, and seize the bridges over the Meuse River. All this in less than 3 days. If he succeeded, the 6th Panzer Army, to which he belonged, could fan out and facilitate the entry into Antwerp. But there was a problem. Everything depended on secrecy and speed. If the Allies detected the attack before the German tanks crossed the front line, the plan fell apart. So a silent build-up of forces was organized. For weeks, trains carried entire divisions to the Western Front. They hid in the forests. Radios remained silent. Orders were delivered by messenger. Even the soldiers believed they were being sent to defend the West Wall, not to launch an offensive. In total, more than 200,000 German soldiers were secretly lined up along the Belgian border. 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns were committed, along with more than 2,000 artillery pieces. Most came from units that had already fought in Normandy or on the Eastern Front. Some regiments were far below their theoretical strength, but they were still assigned to the attack. The entire offensive was divided into three axes. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army with the SS divisions, including Kampfgruppe Peiper. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army with more conventional Heer units. And in the south, the 7th Army, tasked with covering the left flank and preventing counterattacks. The center of gravity was in the north. The most mobile and best-equipped units went there. And it was there that Peiper had to open the route. While all this was happening on the other side of the front, the Americans occupied the sector with both exhausted and new divisions. The newly arrived 106th Infantry Division occupied the Saint Vith salient. Further north, the 99th Division had its men deployed along towns such as Hofen, Krinkelt, Elsenborn and Bullingen. Many of these soldiers had never been under live fire. The terrain secretly favored Germany. The Ardennes were considered a quiet zone. The Allied High Command didn't expect fighting there in December. It was winter. The roads were dangerous. The forests were covered in snow. The rivers were half frozen. No one imagined that a large-scale offensive would begin in that sector. Hitler ordered the attack to begin on December 16th, just before Christmas, when the weather was at its worst and Allied vigilance at its most relaxed. Weather forecasts called for overcast skies for several days, preventing the Allies from using their air superiority. For the German forces, this was vital. Within the German command, there were doubts. Many generals believed the plan was too ambitious. Some proposed attacking on a smaller scale. Others warned that there wasn't enough fuel to sustain the advance. But Hitler didn't listen. He wanted a big, quick, decisive victory, and he wanted it now. The maps were ready. The routes were assigned. The units were formed up. Each Kampfgruppe had its task. The radios were calibrated. The guns were aimed. The first vehicles had been in position since the night of December 15th. Peiper, at his forward command post, checked the routes one last time. He knew the terrain was difficult, that there would be bottlenecks, that he depended on capturing fuel along the way, but he also knew that if anyone could break through, it would be him. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, 1944, the bombardment began. More than 1,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously on American positions across the Ardennes front. Telephone lines were cut. The trenches were covered in smoke. The first Allied platoons, surprised, responded as best they could. But by then, the offensive was already underway. Kampfgruppe Peiper soon began to move. His tanks advanced on narrow, slippery, ice-covered roads. The columns were long, slow, and vulnerable. But he was at the forefront, determined to break the front with a direct blow. He didn't know what lay ahead, but his order was simple: advance, without stopping, without question. And so began the march of a unit that in just 1 week would become one of the darkest symbols of the war in the West. The story of their advance is also the story of Hitler's last attempt to change the course of a war that was already lost. The first blow, Kampfgruppe Peiper crosses the front. It was still dark when the Ardennes forest began to shake. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, 1944, more than 1,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously on the American front. In a matter of seconds, the icy calm transformed into a storm of noise, explosions, and confusion. In the north of the front, near Losheim, Kampfgruppe Peiper was waiting for the signal to move. Jochen Peiper's objective was clear: advance as quickly as possible to the west, crush the Allied units he encountered along the way, and seize the bridges over the Meuse River. His route was direct, but terrain and surprise would be his greatest weapons. Peiper was not alone. He was part of the 6th Panzer Army, but his unit was the spearhead of the Central Axis. His Kampfgruppe was composed of elements of the 1st Panzer Regiment. half-track vehicles of the 2nd Panzer-Grenadier Regiment, sappers from the SS Engineer Battalion, mobile artillery, and a forward reconnaissance group. In total, some 4,000 men and more than 120 armoured vehicles. The order was to advance without stopping, crush light resistance, ignore flanks, seize key positions and push forward. That same order had been repeated at every command post. Speed was the only way for the offensive to succeed. The first serious contact occurred at Lanzerath, a small town on the Belgian border. There, an American reconnaissance squad from the 394th Infantry Regiment held a defensive position. They numbered just 18 soldiers, armed with rifles and light machine guns, but they held out for more than 8 hours. From their positions in a forest, they managed to delay Peiper's entire reconnaissance battalion, causing casualties and disorganizing the column. That delay was costly. Although insignificant in terms of casualties, it forced a reorganization of the advance. The original schedule called for them to be in Honsfeld by noon, but they were still trying to break through the resistance on a snow-covered road. Frustrated, Peiper ordered a bypass and a rearguard group left behind. As they advanced, the Germans discovered that many villages were barely occupied. American troops had received contradictory orders. In some sectors, they retreated without fighting. In others, they organized improvised defenses. Everything was poorly coordinated. The next objective was Honsfeld, a town with fuel depots and a small garrison of the 99th Field Artillery Battalion. Here, the Germans found vehicles, weapons, ammunition, and unsuspecting soldiers. The first German armored vehicles swept in without warning. Some Americans were caught asleep. Others tried to flee on foot through the icy streets. There was no organized fighting. It was a quick, chaotic, and bloody incursion. At Honsfeld, Peiper's soldiers captured more than 50,000 liters of fuel, as well as jeeps, trucks, and anti-tank guns, but they also carried out executions. Several wounded Allied soldiers were killed on their stretchers. Others were shot after surrendering. No one gave a clear order, but there were no penalties either. Prisoners were assumed to be a liability, and Peiper didn't want liability. After securing the town, the Kampfgruppe continued west. They reached Bullingen, where there were more gasoline depots, as well as positions of the 18th Infantry Battalion of the 2nd Division. The American soldiers, alerted by the sound of the advance, tried to prepare a defense, but the German tanks arrived first. They fired on the depots, the trucks, and the defensive positions. The Americans could do nothing but scatter. In Bullingen, the pattern was repeated again: fuel capture, execution of prisoners, vehicle theft. Peiper advanced, wreaking havoc, but also seizing what he could. The plan didn't include resupply. Every liter of gasoline counted. Every hour gained could be the difference between success and encirclement. After Bullingen, the column reorganized. Peiper divided his force into 3 parts: a spearhead with Panther tanks, a middle section with motorized infantry, and a tail section with artillery and sappers. They traveled along a narrow road surrounded by woods. The terrain was an obstacle in itself, but the column did not stop. Meanwhile, the American commanders were trying to understand what was happening. Reports came in over the radio, but they were contradictory. Units reported attacks at various points. Some spoke of German tanks crossing towns that hours earlier had been considered safe. Others reported that their telephone lines were cut. They didn't know if it was a general offensive or a raid. In Washington and London, the news took longer to arrive. Eisenhower was informed late in the afternoon. By that time, he had already lost contact with several units at the front. He ordered calm and reinforcements to the flanks, but he had no clear information. No one yet understood that what was happening wasn't a local attack. It was the beginning of a battle that would last for weeks. In mid-afternoon, Peiper made a risky decision to advance directly toward Ligneville, crossing barely explored terrain with uncertain reports of mines and ambushes. The safest route was to the north, but it was also slower. He chose the fast track. Bonnier Crossing, a column of the 285th Artillery Observation Battalion, was intercepted by German armored vehicles. The surprised American soldiers were surrounded. They surrendered without firing a shot. About 130 prisoners were taken to an open field at the side of the road. Minutes later, Peiper's troops opened fire. They killed them all, without trial, without operational reason. Some tried to flee. Others feigned death. Only a few managed to escape. That action, known as the Malmedi Massacre, became one of the most infamous episodes of the war. but by that time Peiper had already moved on. At Ligneville, the pattern was repeated. Tanks rolled in firing, defenses were minimal, houses burned, trucks were overturned or destroyed, the bridge was secured. The column barely stopped to reorganize and refuel. Speed remained the priority. The day ended with the Kampfgruppe at the gates of Stavelot, more than 30 kilometers inside the Allied front. They had crushed light resistance, taken key villages and captured hundreds of vehicles, but not without cost. There were delays. The terrain was worse than expected. Fuel was starting to run short again. And worse, the Allies already knew something big was afoot. Despite the advance, Peiper was frustrated. The initial delay at Lanzerath, the disorganization of the columns, the traffic jams on the snowy roads, everything had affected the schedule. The surprise faded with each hour, and on the horizon the Allied resistance was beginning to organize. What came next would be even more difficult. But that night, after their first day of offensive, Jochen Peiper and his men knew they had crossed a line. This was no longer a military operation. It was a brutal march without rules, without restraint, and without return. From Malmedy to Stavelot, brutal advance of Kampfgruppe Peiper, December 17, 1944. Kampfgruppe Peiper had been on the move for just over 24 hours and had already crossed more than 30 kilometers of Allied territory. Despite delays, roadblocks, and a lack of fuel, their advance had been brutal. The orders remained clear: reach the Meuse, crush any resistance along the way, seize the bridges intact, and never stop. But that day, everything would change. Not because of tactics, not because of speed, but because of what happened in a field by the side of the road. In the morning, after reorganizing the column following the capture of Bulge, Peiper decided to head toward Ligneville, a small town on the way to Stavelot. To get there, he had to pass through the Beaugnies Junction, a common intersection between secondary roads halfway between Malmedy and Ligneville. What seemed like just another intersection became a turning point. At the same time, a column of the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, composed of more than 30 light vehicles, was moving along the same route. They were soldiers with no real combat experience, in charge of reconnaissance and logistics operations. They traveled with personal weapons but without heavy armor. They were unaware that the enemy was already so deep inside. The vanguard of Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by light armored vehicles and motorized troops, intercepted the column. There was no battle. The Americans surrendered immediately. They were escorted to an open field a few meters from the road, next to a row of trees. More than 120 soldiers were arranged in formation. They were unarmed, standing still, waiting to be taken prisoner. What happened next has no tactical explanation. Suddenly, without warning, the shooting began. Some Waffen, SS soldiers opened fire with MG-42 machine guns. The line of prisoners fell in seconds. Those who were not killed immediately tried to flee. Several were shot down on the road, others hid in the trees, some feigned death. In the end, more than 80 Americans were killed. Only about 40 managed to escape, most of them wounded, frozen, and traumatized. The site wasn't just any camp. It was exposed, with visibility from several points. That decision, to kill the prisoners in an open space in broad daylight, made the incident impossible to conceal. Hours later, US troops patrolling the area found the bodies. Some were still alive. One of them, with a shattered leg, crawled for hours until he found his comrades. He was one of the first to recount what had happened. News of the Malmedi Massacre spread like wildfire. Within hours, the American divisions knew something brutal had happened. The Allied command received reports but was slow to react. They weren't sure if it was a mass execution or a misunderstood shooting. There were no pictures, no videos, only bodies and fragmented accounts. But for the soldiers patrolling the Ardennes, the message was clear. Peiper's men were taking no prisoners. Meanwhile, Peiper continued his advance. He had left Beaugnies and headed toward Ligneville. In that village, they took an American support unit by surprise. The American soldiers were cooking, some were resting. There was no resistance. The German column entered firing. Trucks were destroyed, positions were taken, and again there were executions. Several American soldiers were killed after surrendering. In one house, 3 men hiding in the cellar were burned alive. Peiper didn't stop. That same afternoon, he advanced toward Stavelot, a key point on his route. The town had a bridge over the Amblève River. If he could cross it intact, he could continue west. But for the first time since the start of the offensive, he encountered organized resistance. Troops from the US 291st Combat Engineer Battalion defended the approach. They had partially blown up the bridge and planted explosives on the nearby roads. Despite not being infantry units, they engaged from the first moment. They used anti-tank guns, improvised mines, and fired from windows. They managed to delay the German entry for several hours. Peiper ordered an attack from several directions. SS tanks attempted to cross the damaged bridge. One tank fell into a ditch, another exploded after passing over a mine. The infantry attempted to encircle the village from the north but were repulsed by mortar fire. The fighting intensified. For the first time, Peiper had to halt his momentum. During this time, his troops became divided. Some platoons took alternative routes to nearby towns such as Trois-Ponts and Parfondry. Clashes raged in these areas. At Trois-Ponts, the Americans had already destroyed the main bridge over the Sambre River, blocking the passage of tanks. The German plan to continue advancing rapidly was beginning to unravel. Back in Stavelot, the fighting grew more intense. Houses were destroyed, crossfire raged, civilians were trapped between the lines. German soldiers used flamethrowers against buildings suspected of harboring snipers. In one case, they burned a house with an entire family inside. The advance became slower, dirtier, more desperate. Peiper knew time was running out. The routes to the Meuse were blocked, fuel was insufficient. In many cases, they had to abandon damaged vehicles because they had no way to tow or repair them. Some tanks were used only as fixed guns. The column was beginning to fragment. Furthermore, news of the Malmedy Massacre hadn't only spread among American troops, it also reached the press. War correspondents sent reports, and soon Allied commanders began to come under pressure to respond. The reaction was direct. From that moment on, many Allied units began to stop taking SS prisoners. The message was clear. If the Germans didn't play by the rules, neither would they. In the following days, this cycle of brutality continued. In areas such as Laglaz and Stumont, soldiers captured by both sides were executed. The war in the Ardennes grew more brutal. Winter, fog, frozen ground, and massacres made this offensive one of the bloodiest on the Western Front. Peiper finally managed to enter Stavelot, but the village was already half destroyed. Half of its vehicles could not move forward. The column stalled. Fuel was running low. Allied artillery bombarded the roads. Units of the US 30th Army Corps were approaching from the north. The encirclement began. In the following days, as the German offensive continued in other areas, Peiper could no longer advance. He was trapped between destroyed villages, blocked rivers, and roads littered with craters and corpses. The fight would shift from offensive to defensive, but the image of Peiper and his Kampfgruppe had already been sealed. They were not just a combat unit, they were directly responsible for one of the worst massacres of prisoners of war on the entire Western Front, and that burden would follow them to the end. Stumont and Laglaz. The trap closes. December 19, 1944. After 3 days of continuous advance, Kampfgruppe Peiper was exhausted. The tanks had been stuck for hours on icy roads. Fuel was running low. Fog still shrouded the Ardennes mountains. And for the first time since they crossed the line, the enemy wasn't fleeing. Now they were organizing, digging trenches, and responding in force. The next objective was Stumont, a small hilltop village with a main road connecting it to Laglaz. That road was the last viable route west. If Peiper failed to take Stumont, he would be trapped, but if he crossed it, he could still reach the Meuse River. That prospect kept him going. Peiper commanded about 800 soldiers, most of them exhausted. His column had been split into multiple sections. Some tanks were out of fuel, others had been destroyed by mines or artillery. Many vehicles were blocked on the narrow roads between Stavelot and Trois-Ponts. Despite everything, they advanced. At 5 a.m., the spearhead of the Kampfgruppe reached the outskirts of Stumont. The town was defended by elements of the US 119th Infantry Regiment, part of the 30th Infantry Division, as well as a platoon of Sherman tanks from the 740th Armored Battalion. The Americans knew a major attack was coming. They had received reports of prisoners, intercepted radio signals, and rumors among neighboring units. The American soldiers dug defensive positions at the edge of the village, laid anti-tank mines at the entrances, and established snipers in the houses. They knew they couldn't hold out indefinitely, but they had one advantage. The Germans didn't know how well defended the place was. The first German assault began at dawn. Peiper sent 6 Panther tanks followed by motorized infantry. The column entered along the main road, firing on both sides. The houses began to burn. Allied soldiers responded with anti-tank fire from windows, cellars, and trenches. Every street became a battlefield, every house a makeshift bunker. On the hill behind the village stood the St. Edward Sanatorium, a large stone building with a direct view over the valley. There, besides American troops, were over 200 Belgian civilians, mostly elderly women and children. When the fighting began, they sought refuge in the cellars. Allied artillery rained down on the village without pause. The shots made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The Germans managed to capture the sanatorium on the first day. From there, they visually controlled the eastern entrance to the village. Peiper used it as a command center. He parked several armored vehicles in the garden and placed heavy machine guns in the windows, but that advantage wouldn't last. The Americans, seeing the Germans digging in, began to reorganize. Sector command was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy. Along with them came reinforcements from the 112th Infantry Regiment, self-propelled artillery pieces, and combat engineers. The plan was to encircle Laglaz and Stumont, cut off all exits, and completely annihilate Kampfgruppe Peiper. Meanwhile, at Laglaz, located 5 kilometers from Stumont, German units began to fortify themselves. They knew that if the advance failed, they would have to retreat there. They blocked streets, prepared firing points, laid mines, and even used destroyed vehicles as barricades. Civilians were forced to take shelter in cellars or evacuate on foot. On December 20th, the fighting intensified. American tanks counterattacked from the east. They entered Stumont from several directions. They managed to recapture part of the village, but were repulsed by crossfire. There was hand-to-hand fighting in the streets, flamethrower attacks, and explosions at every corner. The Germans maintained control of the heights, the Americans, the artillery. That same day, Allied engineers destroyed the bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts, completely cutting off Peiper's retreat. The encirclement was closed. German attempts to send reinforcements from the east failed. The rest of the 1st SS Panzer Corps was trapped in massive traffic jams on the Ardennes roads, bombarded from the air. They couldn't advance. No one would come to Peiper's aid. At the front, every hour counted. On December 21st, a company of paratroopers from the 504th Infantry Regiment crossed the Amblève River and attacked from the north. They captured several houses on the edge of Stumont and pushed the German line back toward the center of the village. The fighting was fierce. In a church, they trapped a dozen German soldiers who refused to surrender. They burned them alive with flamethrowers. The Americans began using loudspeakers with recordings of surrenders in German. The Germans responded with mortar fire. It was a relentless fight. Many soldiers slept 2 hours a day, ate snow, and fought with ammunition scavenged from the dead. German snipers, hidden in attics and towers, caused casualties every hour. Meanwhile, at Laglaz, civilians struggled to survive under the bombardment. There was no electricity. Water was scarce. Houses were collapsing from artillery shelling. SS soldiers used cellars to hide wounded. Some officers slept on damp mattresses between splintered beams. The situation was critical, and Peiper knew it. That day, he sent a coded message to the headquarters of the 6th Panzer Army. Fuel exhausted, artillery destroyed, wounded without evacuation, requesting permission to withdraw. There was no reply. The High Command still had the illusion that the offensive was still viable. Peiper was left to his fate. By December 22nd, the village of Stumont was rubble. The few operational German tanks were firing from fixed positions. The infantry, entrenched in ruined houses, resisted each attack. But the attrition was evident. There was no food, no spare ammunition, no escape routes remained. The Americans reinforced their positions with more tanks, self-propelled guns, and fresh units. In some sectors, the fighting was all knife-wielding. The dead piled up in cellars and courtyards. The stench filled the streets. It was no longer a battle for territory. It was a fight to avoid being annihilated. That same day, Peiper decided to evacuate Stumont and concentrate on Laglaz. He ordered a withdrawal in small groups, covered by fire from the last operational armored vehicles. The houses were blown up with internal charges to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The sanatorium was abandoned. The civilians were once again caught between two fires. At Laglaz, the situation was no better. Most of the artillery had been disabled. Fuel was rationed to 1 can per vehicle. Tanks were used only to cover fixed sectors. Morale was low. Some soldiers were talking about surrendering. Others were preparing to die there. That night, Peiper gathered his officers in a cellar. He told them they would continue fighting until further orders were received, that they would hold out with whatever they had, that if they fell, they would do so fighting. Not everyone agreed, but no one contradicted him yet. Counterattacks and attrition, Allied defences are hardened. That same December 22nd, late at night in Laglaz, Jochen Peiper lit a candle over the map covered in markings. He had no electricity, no working radio. Only candles, dirty papers, and a group of officers with their faces cracked by the cold. Outside, the town was a ruin, and all around, every road, bridge, and hill was controlled by the enemy. Kampfgruppe Peiper was completely cut off. That day, the last contact with the headquarters of the 6th Panzer Army confirmed what they already knew. There would be no reinforcements. The rest of the Army Corps was held up in bottlenecks to the east, blocked by the logistical collapse, by Allied artillery, and by the ground crumbling beneath the snow. No German unit could open a corridor to rescue Peiper. They were on their own. On the outskirts of Laglaz, the Germans had fortified houses, set up barricades, converted destroyed half-tracks into parapets, and deployed snipers on the roofs. They had adapted to the encirclement. But it was no longer a matter of resisting an attack. It was a matter of surviving a siege without supplies, without an escape route, and with an enemy determined to destroy them. The American troops intensified their offensive. From the north, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division advanced with precision. They knew every hill, every trail. They used supporting artillery like a hammer. They would pound for hours, then send a company to take the ruins and then retreat. They wanted to wear down, not just kill. From the west, the 119th Infantry Regiment was pushing from Stumont. The paratroopers who had taken the outskirts of the village were now descending into the valley, crossing makeshift bridges and advancing through the snow to reach the edge of Laglaz. The houses that had served as defences against the Germans crumbled with each explosion. The temperature dropped each night. Visibility was almost zero. On the German side, fuel had already run out for most vehicles. Only a few Panthers were able to move, and they did so with minimal rations, stolen from abandoned trucks or cans looted from villages. The rest served as a static defense. On many occasions, tanks were sunk in the mud and used as machine gun nests. The main gun, if lucky, fired once or twice a day. In the village's basements, wounded soldiers piled up. Medical personnel improvised with whatever they had, bandages torn from blankets, rusty scalpels, frozen morphine drips. Some soldiers died of gangrene, others simply collapsed from lack of warmth. There was no way to evacuate anyone. There was nowhere to take them. Despite this, Peiper maintained the command structure. Each company had clear orders. Every crossing was defended. Every ruin was occupied by a squad. Discipline was strict. Executions for desertion were immediate. There was no room for weakness. On December 23rd, the Americans launched a coordinated offensive. From the south, units of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion advanced on the valley's evacuation roads. They used explosives to fell trees, blow up secondary bridges, and seal off remaining escape routes. From the east, heavy artillery relentlessly pounded the German center line. That same day, the Germans attempted to revive one of their Tigeries. They towed it with 2 half-tracks and used the last liters of gasoline available. The tank managed to move 500 meters before getting stuck in a frozen ditch. It remained there, stranded, converted into a makeshift bunker. Today, that same vehicle remains in Laglaz as a memorial. The battle reached one of its most savage points in the northern part of the town. A group of American soldiers managed to enter through the rear of a farmhouse and ambushed a German platoon. The fighting was fought with grenades and knives. At the end, 16 bodies were piled up in a corral. No one was taken prisoner. Exhaustion affected everyone. Food was scarce. German soldiers cooked frozen potatoes in empty gasoline cans. Some melted snow with explosives to drink water. Guns jammed with ice. Feet became gangrenous. The screams of the wounded were constant in the tunnels. Peiper sent another request to retreat. The message was intercepted by the Allies, who used the frequency to send a fake reply. Permission granted. Withdraw to the north. When a group of 40 soldiers attempted to do so, they were ambushed. Only 3 survived. From then on, communications became useless. At the American headquarters, reports spoke of a trapped German unit resisting fiercely but on the verge of collapse. The generals of the US First Army debated whether to launch an all-out assault or maintain the encirclement. They decided to continue with the slow method: constant pressure, sustained bombardment, targeted attacks. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the fighting continued. There was no respite. There were no chants, only fire, explosions, and death. At Laglaz, the remnants of Kampfgruppe Peiper were no longer fighting to advance, but to survive a few more hours. That night, beneath the snow and the silence of the ruins, Jochen Peiper gathered his officers in a destroyed kitchen. He explained the situation. There were no reinforcements, no fuel, no food. The positions were untenable. The only option was to abandon the village on foot, in small groups, without heavy equipment, without lights, without protection. It was a retreat through the forest between enemy lines with wounded in sub-zero temperatures. The decision had been made. That morning, the riskiest operation since they crossed the line 3 days earlier would begin. An escape through the snow without maps, without support, and without hope of help. But that would be the next chapter. The retreat on foot, the end of Kampfgruppe Peiper, night of December 24th, 1944. While many in Europe were looking for ways to celebrate Christmas Eve amidst ruins and canned rations, in the Belgian village of Laglaz, Jochen Peiper was preparing the opposite. His unit, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was surrounded. It could no longer move forward or to the rear. The fuel had run out, the artillery was disabled, the positions were indefensible. The only option left was to escape, on foot, at night, through the woods. Hours earlier, Peiper had gathered his officers. He gave them clear instructions: destroy all vehicles and heavy pieces that couldn't be carried, divide the unit into small groups, and advance silently eastward, crossing the American lines undetected. They would not carry radios. There would be no support. It was a suicidal operation, but it was that or surrender. And surrender was not an option for the Waffen-SS officers. That morning, under darkness, the retreat began. About 800 men left Laglaz in single file, advancing along secondary roads, snow-covered paths and frozen forests. They carried light backpacks, individual weapons, and barely any food. Many did not have proper boots. Some walked with their feet wrapped in blankets or dirty bandages. The priority was stealth. No voices were allowed. No flashlights were lit. They advanced at the pace of the slowest. If anyone fell, they were left behind. The wounded who could not walk were abandoned in the basements of houses, next to handwritten signs pleading for help in several languages. They knew that if the Americans didn't kill them, the cold would. Meanwhile, at Laglaz, the last soldiers carried out orders, placing demolition charges on the tanks, setting fire to the half-tracks, destroying the maps, burning the reports. Some did it with tears in their eyes, others in silence. What had been an elite armored unit was now a phantom column marching through the snow. In total, more than 50 armored vehicles were left behind, including King Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, self-propelled artillery, half-tracks and trucks. Several were simply abandoned in the middle of the road with broken tracks or engines, unusable. The next day, the Americans would find many in repairable condition. The retreat was hellish. The terrain was uneven, with slopes, ravines, and icy roads. The soldiers advanced in sub-zero temperatures without sleep, without food, without rest. Some fainted from exhaustion. Others suffered hallucinations from the cold and hunger. Every step was a struggle. At several points, the German groups encountered American patrols. In some cases, there were brief firefights. In others, they managed to avoid contact by detouring through the woods. The darkness and bad weather worked in their favor. But they also caused disorientation. Some platoons got lost and ended up walking in circles for hours. The objective was to reach the German lines near Warna and Stavelot, where units of the 6th Panzer Army were still present. But the area was under constant fire. The roads were blocked. The bridges were destroyed. There were no signs, no clear reference points. Those who knew the terrain went to the front. The rest remained silent. One of the most difficult points was crossing the Salm River. The water was partially frozen but impassable. Natural passages, makeshift bridges, and wading areas had to be found. Some soldiers crossed through chest-deep water, others drowned. An entire platoon was ambushed near the river and wiped out. Most of the groups that managed to cross the river did so in the early hours of December 25th. By that point, they had been walking for more than 10 hours. Several soldiers could not feel their feet. Others had lost pieces of equipment. Mud and snow had covered their uniforms. Some walked without helmets, others without gloves. It was a spectral retreat. Meanwhile, at Laglaz, American troops finally entered the town. They found it in ruins. The streets were littered with scrap metal, burning vehicles and frozen bodies. In the cellars, they discovered the wounded who had been left behind. Some died soon after. Others survived thanks to Allied medical intervention. The outcome was clear. Kampfgruppe Peiper, which had begun the offensive with more than 4,000 men and 130 vehicles, ended the campaign as a column of unarmed soldiers fleeing through the trees, with fewer than 1,000 troops fit to fight. The rest had been killed, captured, or were missing. That same day, Peiper crossed the German lines. He was at the head of his column. He was covered in mud, his beard overgrown, his face haggard. He no longer wore the immaculate uniform he had worn when he began the operation. He carried a pistol, a pair of binoculars, and little else. He was met by officers of the 1st SS Panzerkorps, who immediately removed him from the front. He no longer had a unit to command. The remnants of the Kampfgruppe were regrouped, sent to the rear, and absorbed into other divisions. Some soldiers never returned to the front. Others were redeployed weeks later, but the myth was already sealed. What had begun as the most feared group of the German attack ended as a story of attrition, defeat, and flight. In the following weeks, the Allies interrogated hundreds of prisoners captured in the area. They collected testimonies, documents, maps, and personal diaries. Many of them spoke of the retreat, of how Peiper had tried to maintain order, of how some officers refused to abandon their tanks, of how others took advantage of the chaos to disappear. They also found evidence of executions during the escape. On a farm, they found the bodies of several Belgian civilians shot in the back of the head. On a nearby road, 3 American prisoners had been shot at point-blank range. There were no witnesses, no searches, just bodies and silence. The retreat from Laglaz became a symbol, not only because of the tactical defeat, but because it demonstrated the physical and moral limits of an elite German unit sent to fulfill an impossible objective. The myth of the lightning offensive died in the forests of the Ardennes, amid broken trees and frozen blood. That was the end of Kampfgruppe Peiper as a combat unit, but it would not be the end of its story. Malmedi Massacre. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Berlin lay in ruins. Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich was destroyed, but not everything ended on the battlefield. For many German officers, the true surrender came months later in the courts. One of the names that resonated most in the Allied ranks was Jochen Peiper. The story of his unit, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was already known. It had been the spearhead of the German attack in the Ardennes. It had broken lines, sown chaos, executed prisoners, and committed one of the most brutal massacres of the Western Front. That crime, the Malmedi Massacre, was not forgotten. And as soon as the war ended, the United States Army began investigating it. The survivors of the 285th Artillery Battalion were located. Their testimonies coincided. They all spoke of the same thing. They had surrendered, been disarmed, gathered in a field, and without provocation, the Waffen-SS soldiers had executed them. Some fired bursts of machine gun fire, others finished off the wounded on the ground. There were remains of shell casings, armored vehicle tracks, and dozens of corpses. No one disputed that it had been a massacre. The US Army's War Crimes section collected the data. It gathered medical reports, maps, aerial photographs, and testimony from soldiers and civilians. It identified the possible perpetrators. In total, 74 members of the 1st SS Panzer Division were arrested. Among them was Jochen Peiper. The trial took place at the former Dachau concentration camp, which had been converted into a detention center and military tribunal. It began in May 1946 and lasted several months. It dealt with the murders of more than 80 American prisoners at Baugny, as well as other executions carried out during the German advance in the Ardennes. The defendants were presented as a group. These were not individual trials, but a collective case. The prosecution argued that the crimes had been committed by units under Peiper's direct command and that, as commander, he was responsible. The issue at hand was not whether he pulled the trigger, but rather whether he condoned, ordered, or failed to prevent the murders. During the trial, several of the defendants presented signed confessions detailing the events. They stated that the prisoners had been executed on orders from the verbal, that the executions were known to the officers, that no one was arrested for doing so, that it was part of the logic of the campaign. However, these confessions became controversial. The defense claimed that they had been obtained through torture, threats, and mock executions. They claimed that several of the accused were beaten, kept awake for days, and subjected to physical and psychological pressure. One of the soldiers, Rudolf Freimuth, committed suicide after confessing. Another claimed to have been forced to sign under threat of death. The trial became a scandal. The American press echoed the accusations. Some newspapers questioned the validity of the confessions. In the United States Congress, a special commission headed by Senator Raymond Baldwin began reviewing the case. Malmedy's trial became the focus of a debate over the legality of post-war judicial proceedings. Meanwhile, the prosecutors held their ground. They showed photographs of the frozen bodies at the Bonyas camp. They presented forensic reports. They reproduced testimonies from survivors who had escaped wounded. They showed maps showing the routes of Kampfgruppe Peiper and lists of documented executions in Honsfeld, Lineuville, and Stavelot. In July 1946, the verdict came in. 43 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. 22 others received life imprisonment. The rest received lesser sentences. Johann Peiper was sentenced to death. The condemned men asked to be shot like soldiers. The court refused. The gallows were prepared. The executions were scheduled for 1948. But then, political pressure began. With the Cold War underway, West Germany was becoming a key ally against the Soviet Union. The new German government pushed for a review of the trials. American politicians began to question the methods used at Dachau. General Lucius Clay, the military governor in Germany, ordered a review of the entire process. A military commission concluded that there had been serious irregularities. The confessions obtained under duress could not be considered valid evidence. The sentences were reviewed. The executions were suspended. A wave of commutations of sentences began. By 1951, most of the death sentences had been overturned. Prisoners began to be released gradually. In 1956, after 11 years in prison, Johann Peiper was released. He had spent 5 years on death row, awaiting execution. Now he was walking out the front door. Peiper retired to civilian life. He worked as a translator and editor for a German publishing house. He then moved to France, to a small town called Treves in the Haute-Saône region. He bought an old house, lived with his wife, and avoided public appearances. But he didn't go unnoticed. Anti-fascist activists began to denounce his presence. Campaigns were organized to expel him. Graffiti, threats, and pamphlets appeared. Some neighbors defended him. Others wanted him out. Peiper remained silent. He knew he couldn't hide forever. On July 13, 1976, someone set fire to his house. It is still unknown who did it. It is believed to have been an armed far-left group. Peiper was burned to death inside. His body was found with a rifle in his hand. There was no trial. No one was arrested. No group was found guilty, blamed for the attack. That was how Johann Peiper's life ended. He had survived the war, a war crimes trial, a death sentence, and prison. But he couldn't escape his past. Malmedi Massacre is still remembered as one of the most atrocious crimes committed by German units on the Western Front. The site of the murder was transformed into a memorial. There are plaques, photographs, and names engraved in stone. Every year, veterans and families of the victims gather there to pay tribute. Peiper's case set a precedent. He was one of the few high-ranking German commanders tried for a specific crime committed in battle, not in concentration camps or extermination camps. His trial, conviction, and release symbolized the complexity of post-war justice between truth, politics, and memory. But beyond the courtroom, the facts speak for themselves. In December 1944, under direct orders, a combat unit murdered unarmed soldiers, destroyed entire villages, and left a trail of terror in its wake. That crime was imprinted on documents, photographs, and graves. And so, beyond the trial, history has never forgotten Peiper, nor what his Kampfgruppe accomplished in the frozen forests of the Ardennes.